Hello everyone and welcome to week 6. Our focus for this week is the composition phase of the design cycle. I've chosen for inspiration this week this composition by Thomas Bauer, and it represents 2,000 separate pieces that come together to create a holistic visual experience of the number 2. I thought this piece might be appropriate considering that essentially what you're going to be doing in this next phase of the design cycle is bringing your individual artifacts together to represent a whole artifact. Now in this video we're going to talk about the composition stage and explore the difference between creation and composition. We're also going to talk a little bit about what a design ecosystem is and how it can help in your workflow, and give some considerations to what you need to be thinking about in terms of formatting of your work. Now, the difference between creating and composing design work is actually relatively straightforward, but is often confused. In the previous stage of the design cycle, you were involved in the process of creating assets for your design problems. While it's important to note that you may still be involved in that process, which is perfectly fine, the next phase is to think about how you compose those artifacts and put them together for your final composition. Now, when you're involved in the creation phase, your primary focus is on building and creating assets that can be used in your design work. This can include files or photos or images, which you then save to a directory which can be accessed later. What makes the composition stage somewhat different is that essentially what you are doing is bringing all of those assets together in your design work. So this is what makes it dependent on the artifacts, the assets that you've already created. So the creation stage is really important for the composition stage. Now, what your composition will look like is entirely dependent on the nature of your design problem. So a design or composition of a multimedia presentation would be completely different than the composition of an infographic. However, the point here is that you're taking your design assets and composing them into a piece that is ready for sharing. One of the first things you should do when you start the composition phase is to review your design goals as well as the design barriers as they relate to your design problem. This is a critical step because what you're essentially doing is going back and reviewing your plan of action, and that will put you as well through the process of curating, creating, and composing all over again. Remember, this is a cyclical process. It's organic, it's ongoing. You're constantly going to be going back and forth between creating assets and composing pieces. However, what's really important is that as you are working in this process, you stay true to your design goals and your plan of action. One of the greatest challenges people experience in this phase is when they have created assets across multiple mediums and are trying to combine them, that you have issues of compatibility. This is where the idea of a design ecosystem becomes valuable. Essentially, a design ecosystem is where you take all of these formats that you've been working with and try to fit them together. By definition, a design ecosystem is a set of applications that work well together and allow the designer to share assets across platforms. One example would be the Adobe Creative Suite. This is a design ecosystem that includes several applications such as Illustrator, Photoshop, and InDesign, and there are many others. However, what's important to note that this is an ecosystem where all of these components work together. So, let's say, for example, you've created a vector shape in Adobe Illustrator, and you've also taken a photograph that you've manipulated in Photoshop. In the composition stage, what you'll need to do is bring these two assets together to create your design artifact. In this case, Adobe InDesign is a program that can be used to compose different elements that come from different programs. This might be particularly if you're designing something for print, and essentially what you would do is bring together your illustration and your photograph into InDesign. Once you've put it into InDesign, you can then format it and determine where you want to publish it from there. We'll say in this case that you want to publish to the web, and Adobe has an app for that, and it's called Dreamweaver. Now, the important point here is not that Adobe is the most amazing ecosystem in the world and the only one that you should use. However, it's that each of these software programs work together to ensure compatibility. The advantage here is that the applications speak a common language, which allows for the easy sharing of assets. There are many other examples of platforms that do the same thing, such as Apple's iLife, which has iPhoto, iMovie, and GarageBand. Now, these can also be used to create multimedia content. And again, I want to reiterate that the value here is not placing the importance or emphasizing that one platform is better than the other. This is not a Mac versus PC debate. Rather, it's highlighting the importance of taking compatibility into consideration during your composition stage. Trust me when I say you don't want to be up in the middle of the night trying to figure out how to get one picture into a program. Exporting and importing can be a nightmare. It's also important as we talk about compatibility to familiarize yourself with the different file formats that relate to different mediums that you may be using. What you should keep in mind in this stage is your end user and how you're going to share the work with them. For example, if you were to send a picture to somebody in PSD format, which is the default file format for Photoshop, then when it gets sent to their interface, they may not be able to open it. However, if you were to send that image in a JPEG format, which is universally recognizable format, then it would be visible on both computers. Plus, it would also be visible on other devices, which is something that we need to take into consideration when designing for multiple platforms. Another example would be if you were to create a bitmap. Now, this is an example that many people have experienced or will experience at some point in their life. If you created a bitmap that had a low resolution, it might look great on your screen, but when you send it to somebody who has a different screen resolution, it might become fuzzy. This is when people refer to their picture as being pixelated, and essentially it's an issue with the image not having the resolution to be compatible with the screen. Now, there are many different things to take into consideration when formatting, which we're going to go into further detail in our case study for the week, so please keep an eye out for that. But the key point that I want to emphasize here is that if you are creating and composing your artifact in a format that's not universally compatible, this can create challenges and barriers for sharing. Now, these challenges can include, but are definitely not limited to, the user not being able to open up the file, or the quality of the artifact being compromised. It might look different, as is the case with a pixelated image, or it might sound different if you were trying to send an audio file. The other thing is that the overall composition of the artifact may change. You may set a resolution of a 16:9 aspect ratio, and when you send it, it might get squished to a 4:3. What ends up happening is that all of your elements that you've carefully designed are now messed up. So, this is something that you definitely don't want to happen. And what's important to note here is that when you're composing your artifact, you should be publishing it in a format that is accessible across multiple devices. You're strongly encouraged to explore this further as it relates to your specific artifact, but it's definitely something that I wanted to take some time to point out. Now, as you move forward in the composition stage of the design cycle, there are also some things that you're going to need to explore further. The first one is you should be thinking about the workflow that you're using to organize and manage your creative assets. I can't overestimate the importance of this. Choosing a system, an application that's a part of an ecosystem can help in the sharing of assets across different applications. However, this might not be an option for you, particularly if you're working in a team environment. So it's important to articulate a process by which you're going to share files in a way that is accessible to everyone. The next question to take into consideration is what applications are best suited to the composition of your design artifact. Now, You might have different applications that you've become very comfortable with, but the question is, are they going to help you put all of these different pieces together? This will depend on the type of artifact that you're building, and you should take into consideration the ability of the program to manage assets across multiple sources. For example, if you're working with a picture in Photoshop and then you bring in a text into Photoshop, can it handle text as well as something like Illustrator can? The answer can only be found in the experience, and as noted before, visual design is trial and error, and mostly error. The third question that I'd like you to take some time to explore is what standards need to be utilized in the composition of your artifact. This will again depend on the medium that you are using for your artifact, but it's important because meeting standards for the specific medium will help to ensure the quality of your work. One of the default standards for video that is commonly used now is a minimum of 720p or 1080p, which is referred to as high definition. Now, what this looks like on different platforms will depend on the level of compression that you've used for your video, but the point here is that you need to think about the formatting elements as well as the design elements when you are sharing your work. Finally, I'd like you to think about how you're going to test to ensure that your artifact is accessible across multiple platforms. As we've noted, accessibility is an important aspect of design work, and one of the easiest ways you can test to see if your artifact is going to be compatible is to send it to a variety of people and to see if they can receive it, open it, and get them to think about what it looks like. Send it to people who you know will have access to different types of computers though. If you have all friends who have the same computer and the same operating system, it doesn't really help you much. Try people who have both new and old computers, Macs and PCs, desktops and mobile operating systems, and try to find or identify deficiencies in compatibility. So, that's about it for this week. If you have any questions, as usual, please feel free to email me at the email that's on the screen, or better yet, post your questions to the Edmodo community so they can be responded to by your peers and the facilitators.
For watching the Week 6 context.